Singapore welcomes over 1 million foreign workers every year. They build the skyscrapers, they clean the streets, they care for the elderly in their homes. Without them, this gleaming city-state would cease to function within weeks. So why are they invisible in every official narrative about Singapore's success? This isn't about immigration policy, it's about what happens when a society builds prosperity on a labor system so stratified that calling it a class structure would be generous, when economic necessity creates social apartheid, when the people who make your city possible are legally prevented from becoming part of it. But before we start, if you're interested in understanding how modern economies really work, subscribe now and share your thoughts in the comments. Singapore's migrant worker system operates on a principle of elegant brutality. Maximum economic extraction, minimum social integration. The architecture of this system reveals itself in legal categories that sort human beings with the precision Singapore applies to everything else. At the top, employment pass holders, foreign professionals earning above a threshold that adjusts upward regularly. These individuals can bring families, access quality health care, eventually apply for permanent residency. They live in condominiums, send children to international schools, accumulate wealth that can be transferred across borders. Singapore courts them actively, positions them as part of the global talent pool that makes the city competitive. One level down, S-Pass holders, mid-skilled workers in sectors the economy needs but doesn't particularly value. Lower salary thresholds, more restrictions, less certainty. They can bring spouses if they earn enough, but dependents remain conditional privileges, not rights. Their path to permanence exists theoretically, but narrows with each policy revision. Below them, work permit holders. This category contains the majority of Singapore's foreign labor force, construction workers from Bangladesh and India, domestic workers from the Philippines and Indonesia, service staff from Myanmar and Thailand. For these individuals, Singapore offers something simple: money in exchange for labor, nothing more. Work permit holders cannot bring families. They cannot marry Singaporeans without ministerial approval, a process designed to discourage rather than facilitate. They cannot access most public services. Their legal status expires the moment their employment ends. Get injured, get sick, lose your job, and your right to remain in Singapore vanishes simultaneously. The system's elegance lies in this absolute dependency. Workers remain productive precisely because they have no option to be otherwise. The dormitory system makes this dependency physical and visible, at least to those willing to look. Purpose-built worker accommodation exists in industrial zones at the city's edges, spaces designed for efficiency, not dignity. 12 to 20 men share rooms meant for comfort at density 1/5 that number. Shared bathrooms service hundreds. Communal cooking areas operate in shifts because demand exceeds capacity continuously. These aren't slums that emerged from neglect. They're engineered accommodation that emerged from calculation. How many workers can we house per square meter while remaining within legal minimums? The regulations governing dormitories reveal priorities with uncomfortable clarity. Minimum floor space per person, 7 square meters. For context, Singapore's prison cells provide 9. Ventilation requirements exist, but enforcement depends on inspections that happen infrequently. Fire safety standards were updated only after major incidents forced acknowledgement that current rules were inadequate. The workers who sleep 20 to a room are the same workers building luxury apartments with ceiling heights designed for grandeur and bedroom sizes meant for comfort. They construct what they'll never inhabit, experience daily the contrast between the Singapore they build and the Singapore they're permitted to access. The spatial segregation extends beyond dormitories into everyday movement. Little India and Geylang become de facto gathering zones on Sundays when workers have time off. Not because these areas offer particular amenities, but because they're among the few spaces where large groups of foreign workers can congregate without immediate social discomfort or official scrutiny. The invisible boundaries are real. Migrant workers quickly learn which malls, which parks, which neighborhoods welcome their presence, and which communicate through social cues that they should move along. Singapore's famous public spaces are public with qualifications. The employment structure guarantees dependency at every level. Employers hold work permits, not workers. This simple administrative detail creates power imbalances that shape every interaction. A worker who reports safety violations risks termination, which means deportation. A domestic worker who experiences abuse must choose between staying silent or losing legal status. The system's design ensures that the most vulnerable have the least recourse. Complain and you're replaceable, stay quiet and you're profitable. The economic logic is impeccable even as the human cost accumulates. Salary structures reflect these power dynamics with precision. Construction workers earn between 800 and 1,200 Singapore dollars monthly. Domestic workers who work unlimited hours in private homes with minimal oversight earn between 600 and 700. These wages are multiples of what workers could earn in home countries, which is precisely why the system functions. The calculation is transparent, pay enough to make migration worthwhile, but far too little to enable accumulation of wealth that might provide independence or options. Keep workers in permanent states of economic necessity that guarantee continued labor availability. The injury and illness protocols expose the system's fundamental logic most clearly. Workplace accidents in construction occur at rates far higher than official statistics suggest because reporting depends on employer cooperation and workers have every incentive to underreport. An injured worker becomes a liability. Medical costs, reduced productivity, potential legal exposure. The economically rational response is deportation, and the system facilitates exactly that. Workers injured on job sites find themselves on flights home before they fully understand their injuries' long-term implications. The costs are externalized, borne by families and health systems in sending countries, rather than by the employers or the state that profited from their labor. COVID-19 revealed these fault lines with brutal clarity. When the virus spread through dormitories, infection rates among migrant workers exceeded those in the general population by orders of magnitude. The same density that made accommodation profitable made disease spread inevitable. The government responded with lockdowns and testing, but the fundamental structure that created vulnerability remained untouched. Workers stayed in the same dormitories under the same conditions once they tested negative. The crisis highlighted what was always true but usually invisible. Foreign workers inhabited a parallel Singapore, one where different rules applied and different assumptions about human welfare governed decision-making. The domestic worker situation deserves separate examination because it occurs literally behind closed doors. An estimated 250,000 women work in Singapore homes, caring for children, elderly relatives, managing households. They live with employers, work hours limited only by human endurance, exist in legal gray zones where labor protections apply inconsistently, if at all. A mandatory day off was instituted only in recent years, and even that can be negotiated away if workers agree to compensation. The power imbalance inherent in living with your employer in a foreign country, with legal status tied to that specific employment, creates conditions ripe for exploitation even when employers have no malicious intent. The agency system that facilitates domestic worker hiring adds another layer of extraction. Workers pay fees equivalent to months of salary for placement, creating immediate debt that ensures they cannot leave even exploitive situations without financial ruin. Agencies profit from turnover, from placement fees charged to both workers and employers, from the vulnerable position workers occupy. The government licenses these agencies, but the regulatory framework assumes goodwill rather than enforcing accountability. Workers who experience problems must navigate systems in languages they don't speak, in legal contexts they don't understand, while maintaining employment or facing deportation. The pregnancy testing requirements for work permit renewals crystallize the system's underlying philosophy. Female work permit holders must undergo pregnancy tests every 6 months. Pregnancy means immediate repatriation. The logic is explicit. Singapore imported labor, not families. Reproduction is not part of the contract. The policy assumes that pregnancy represents a breach of the economic transaction, as if biology itself must yield to administrative convenience. That such a policy can exist, can be enforced routinely, reveals how completely certain categories of workers have been defined as economic units rather than human beings with rights and dignity. The stratification within foreign worker categories itself deserves attention. Malaysian workers arriving daily across the causeway occupy an intermediate category. They can work in Singapore, return home nightly, avoid the dormitory system entirely. This geographical accident of proximity creates a class of foreign workers with fundamentally different experiences. They see families regularly, maintain homes outside the system, possess mobility that workers from more distant countries cannot access. The accident of birthplace determines whether you're trapped in the system or merely participating in it temporarily. The long-term implications of this labor model are beginning to surface in ways policy cannot easily address. Singapore's birth rate of 0.83 children per woman creates a demographic crisis. The economy needs workers, but the population cannot replace itself. The logical solution would be creating pathways for productive workers to become permanent residents, to build families, to stay. But that solution conflicts with carefully maintained ethnic ratios, with political commitments to a certain vision of Singaporean identity, with social resistance to diversity that crosses class lines. The system needs workers to arrive, stay temporary, and leave. But temporary workers don't solve demographic decline. The dependence flows both ways now in manners that weren't anticipated when the system was designed. Singapore needs construction workers to build the infrastructure that maintains its competitive position. It needs domestic workers to enable dual-income families that drive economic growth. It needs service workers to staff the restaurants, shops, and services that make Singapore livable for higher-income residents. Remove the migrant worker population and the economy doesn't slow, it stops. Yet the social and political structure cannot accommodate integrating these workers as equal members of society. The contradiction deepens yearly. The generational question adds complexity. Children born in Singapore to work permit holders have no claim to citizenship, no right to remain, no legal connection to the only country they've known. They exist in legal limbo, often staying illegally after parents' permits expire because returning to countries they've never really known feels like exile. Singapore's citizenship law is just sanguinis, based on parentage, not birthplace. A child born in Singapore to foreign workers has fewer rights than a child born abroad to Singaporean parents. This makes logical sense within the system's framework. It also creates human consequences that logic cannot resolve. The sending country's perspective completes the picture. Remittances from Singapore represent significant percentages of GDP for nations like Bangladesh, the Philippines, and Myanmar. Governments have economic incentives to maintain labor-export relationships to ensure access to Singapore's market. This creates diplomatic dynamics where labor protections become negotiating points rather than guaranteed rights. Bilateral agreements determine wage floors and working conditions, but enforcement depends on cooperation from governments that need the remittance flows. Workers become bargaining chips in relationships between states. The comparison to other Gulf states is invited but limited in usefulness. UAE and Qatar face international criticism for kafala systems that resemble Singapore's work permit structure. But those systems receive scrutiny partly because the countries are less developed in other respects, easier to frame as backward. Singapore escapes comparable criticism because it pairs labor exploitation with gleaming infrastructure, efficient government, and economic success. The system works so well in delivering prosperity to citizens that its costs to non-citizens become footnotes in development narratives. What distinguishes Singapore's approach is the precision of calibration. Gulf states often appear chaotic in labor management, with abuses emerging from weak state capacity as much as intentional policy. Singapore's system is neither chaotic nor accidental. It's engineered with the same careful attention to detail that produces MRT trains running on time and corruption-free bureaucracy. Every element serves a purpose. Every regulation creates specific incentives. The exploitation isn't a bug, it's a feature operating exactly as designed. The question of complicity extends beyond government into society itself. Singaporean families employ domestic workers at rates among the highest globally. They benefit from construction that happens faster and cheaper because worker welfare isn't priced into contracts. They enjoy services made affordable by labor earning fractions of minimum wages in developed economies. The system doesn't just benefit elites, it distributes gains widely enough across citizen population that challenging it means confronting benefits that feel ordinary, not luxurious. Your affordable helper isn't a luxury, she's how you manage dual careers and aging parents. The system made her necessary by making everything else expensive. The international pressure that might force change remains minimal. Singapore's reputation as a well-governed state insulates it from criticism that lands heavily on others. Global firms that emphasize ESG principles and fair labor practices operate in Singapore without apparent cognitive dissonance. The workers are legal, the permits are official, the wages are paid. that the legal framework itself creates exploitative conditions gets lost in the optics of compliance. International labor organizations issue reports noting concerns, but these translate into policy changes slowly, if at all. The sustainability question looms larger as regional economies develop. Bangladesh and India won't remain low-wage suppliers indefinitely. Workers will increasingly have options, and Singapore must compete for labor it currently can take for granted. Improvements in working conditions emerge not from ethical reconsideration but from market pressure. Better dormitories, higher wages, clearer legal protections, these arrive when necessary to maintain labor supply, not because the underlying philosophy about migrant workers' place in society shifted. Some reforms are happening, credit where it's due. The Migrant Workers Center provides resources and support, though its effectiveness is limited by the fundamental power imbalances it cannot address. Dormitory standards have improved following COVID scrutiny. Public discourse acknowledges migrant workers more visibly than before, but these are adjustments within the system, not challenges to it. The stratified labor market, the permits tied to employers, the prohibition on family formation, the acceptance of wage differentials based solely on nationality, all this remains foundational. What would genuine change look like? Portable work permits that allow workers to change employers, legal minimum wages that apply regardless of nationality, pathways to permanent residency for workers who've contributed productively for defined periods, family reunification rights, equal access to legal protections and public services. Each of these would require admitting that migrant workers are not just economic inputs but people whose welfare matters intrinsically. That admission threatens the entire model. Singapore built modernity by separating economic participation from social belonging. It created a society where your contribution to prosperity doesn't guarantee inclusion in prosperity's benefits, where you can be essential to the system while excluded from it. This isn't a failure of the model, it's how the model achieves its goals. The efficiency, the growth, the gleaming infrastructure, all of it rests on being able to access labor without accepting laborers. The migrant workers who make Singapore possible live in a permanent present tense. They cannot build futures here, cannot put down roots, cannot transform economic participation into social membership. Their children won't be Singaporean. Their decades of work won't earn security. They exist in instrumental relationships with a place that needs them absolutely while wanting them only conditionally. And they know this. They accept it because the alternative is worse, because the money sent home builds houses and funds educations in countries they'll return to. But acceptance isn't the same as justice. The system works brilliantly at producing the outcomes it was designed to produce: GDP growth, infrastructure development, clean streets and functioning services. If those are your metrics, Singapore's migrant labor model is a resounding success. But if you expand the frame to include the workers themselves, if you count their welfare in the equation, the picture changes. The invisible workers who make the visible city function have subsidized Singapore's miracle with their labor, their time, their families, their futures. They built this city, it's just not theirs.